I woke up on a bright Saturday morning, barely aware that I was about to go head-to-head with our neighborhood's most notorious busybody. Before we begin this wild journey through crooked fences, cunning sabotage, and epic HOA showdowns, I just want to say, if you love stories of overbearing HOA Karens getting their comeuppance, then be sure to like this video, subscribe to Tailflow, and let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with a neighbor like this. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for every twist and turn, because this saga ends with a beautifully ironic twist that still makes me grin when I think about it. I used to believe that moving to a suburban neighborhood meant finally having room for a grill, a garden, and the kind of tranquil weekend mornings where I could sip coffee on the porch with nothing but birdsong to distract me. That's certainly how it started. Idyllic, the American dream come to life. My wife and I had saved up for years to afford this house, complete with a modest lawn, a shady oak in the back corner, and enough space for a small vegetable garden if we chose to try our hand at growing tomatoes. The property was edged on both sides by tall hedges that predated our ownership, and behind us lay a line of mature trees. But the side yards, those were wide open, and we decided early on that we'd install a fence for a bit of extra privacy. Little did I know that the plan to put up a fence would trigger a chain of events that had me standing on my front porch one morning, staring down the angriest neighbor I'd ever encountered. And that's saying something. I met Karen for the first time a few weeks after we'd moved in, though I'd heard whispers about her before. Karen's the new HOA president, a neighbor informed me with a sympathetic shrug. Watch out, she's extremely strict about everything from mailbox colors to the size of your welcome mat. The name came with so many preconceived notions. Karen, the sort of person who demands to speak to the manager, but I tried to keep an open mind. Maybe she was just a stickler for the rules, which didn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Maybe she was simply misunderstood and her heart was in the right place. Optimism, I suppose, was my biggest flaw back then. My wife and I had always dreamed of building a custom wooden fence. We wanted a sturdy, classic look, something with slats that would last decades if properly maintained. We pored over designs online, pinned pictures to a shared board, and spent hours comparing wood types to figure out the best balance of durability and budget. Ultimately, we chose a design that was about 6.5 feet tall, with a tasteful lattice top that added an extra half-foot for aesthetic appeal. We double-checked the local codes. The city allowed residential fences up to 7 feet in the backyard unless otherwise restricted by the Homeowners Association guidelines. We'd heard the HOA could be picky, so we scoured the official documentation. Lo and behold, they had an official rule about fences not exceeding 6 feet. But the rule also had a clause stating that architectural or decorative elements which do not impede the view may extend up to 8 inches above the maximum height. Perfect, or so we thought. Our fence design included that open lattice top that allowed air and visibility. It seemed to fall neatly within the rule's allowances. We hired a reputable local contractor, someone who'd built fences for multiple homes in the area. He assured us he was familiar with the HOA's requirements. We got all the necessary city permits. Everything appeared to be above board. The day construction began, I remember standing in the yard, the smell of fresh-cut cedar in the air, feeling a sense of joy that we were finally creating the outdoor living space we'd always wanted. The contractor hammered the posts in, making sure they were level. By the time the skeleton of the fence was up, I was beaming with pride. That pride lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning, a loud knock echoed on my front door at about 7 in the morning. I'd only just stumbled downstairs in my pajamas, hair wild, coffee not yet in my system. I opened the door to see a woman with angular features, meticulously styled hair, and a scowl so fierce it could curdle milk. In her hand, a clipboard. I didn't need an introduction to know this was Karen, the infamous HOA president. "We need to talk about your fence," she announced, eyes flicking past me to see the partially completed structure extending down the side of the house. She didn't bother with a greeting or any polite small talk. "You're in violation of the 6-foot rule. You can't just build whatever you like here." It took me a moment to gather my wits. I cleared my throat, forcing a polite smile, and informed her that we'd carefully studied the guidelines, that the fence was 6 feet plus a decorative lattice that should be permissible. She turned the clipboard around to show me a piece of paper with a bold header, "Fence height REQRMENTS." The version she held differed significantly from the one I'd downloaded from the HOA site. This new version stated, "No fence shall exceed 6 feet in total height, inclusive of decorative additions." The decorative allowance of 8 inches was nowhere to be found. I explained that we had a copy of the official guidelines as well, and ours included a mention of decorative elements. Karen gave a dismissive shrug and said, "We updated the rules recently. Perhaps you missed the notice." I'd never received any notice. I told her that calmly. She bristled and insisted the HOA had mailed notifications weeks ago. I started to suspect she was either lying or incompetent, possibly both. Regardless, she made it clear that I was to remove the lattice top immediately or face fines. As she turned on her heel to leave, she added, "I'll be back in a few days to make sure you've complied." Shaken, I combed through my emails, physical mail, and the HOA's online portal. Nowhere did I find any reference to updated fence guidelines. Some neighbors I reached out to said they'd heard rumors that Karen wanted stricter rules, but no official announcements had been made. So was this new policy she showed me even real? My gut told me it was something she cooked up because she disapproved of our fence's height. Perhaps she disliked not being able to peer into our backyard as she marched up and down the street with that clipboard. I emailed the entire HOA board, referencing the older guidelines, pointing out that our design was fully compliant. Only one person replied, a board member named Paula, telling me she was looking into the matter. Everyone else stayed silent. That's when I realized Karen might have a grip on the board, or perhaps she bullied them into submission. By the following week, we'd nearly finished building. The fence posts were all in place, the planks attached, and the lattice top added for that final decorative flourish. Karen reappeared in my driveway wearing a smug expression. She gestured at the fence and said, "I see you haven't made any changes. This is your last warning." I tried to remain polite. I asked her directly to show me official proof of the new regulation. She fiddled with her phone, claiming she had it stored somewhere, but she couldn't find it at the moment, or so she said. When I pressed her, she snapped, "I don't have to prove anything to you. I'm the HOA president, and I'm telling you it's out of compliance." Her tone was final, loaded with condescension. I simply repeated that we had city permits and were abiding by the existing HOA documents. If she wanted us to make changes, she needed to provide official evidence of these new rules. She snarled something about me being stubborn and threatened that I'd regret this. Then she marched off to ring another neighbor's doorbell, probably looking for her next victim. The next few days were tense. I felt this sense of unease, as though Karen was lurking around every corner, waiting to pounce. Sure enough, I started receiving formal notices in my mailbox, paper letters on official HOA letterhead, all referencing the updated fence policy and threatening daily fines if I refused to comply. The amounts were absurd, a daily penalty of $50 for non-compliant fence height. The trouble was, I couldn't find a single shred of evidence that the board had actually voted on or approved this updated policy. The guidelines she cited were nowhere to be found in the official documents. I suspected Karen had typed them up herself, printed them on fancy HOA paper, and was distributing them to intimidate me. I wasn't about to tear down my brand new lattice top based on intimidation alone. My wife and I had invested considerable time and money into it, not to mention the fact that it looked fantastic. We had every right to keep it. Yet the daily notices continued, and with them came mounting stress. We started to worry that maybe Karen had the power to place a lien on our property or forcibly remove the fence. HOAs can be quite powerful depending on the state and the terms in their bylaws. But something in my gut told me she was overstepping, that we had a strong chance of winning any legal dispute if we challenged her. Still, legal battles take time and money, and we weren't exactly eager to dive into one. Around this time, I began hearing rumors that Karen herself had recently built an addition to her own backyard fence, some kind of enclosed extension. I hadn't personally seen it, since her property was on the opposite side of the neighborhood. The rumor mill suggested that the extension was suspiciously tall, possibly even taller than ours, but that she'd told neighbors it was for security reasons and had waived her own fence guidelines. That sounded too hypocritical to be true, but it planted the seed of curiosity in my mind. Determined to see if there was any truth to this, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood under the guise of exercise. My plan was to pass by Karen's home casually. Early on a Sunday morning, I set off, a water bottle in hand, wearing my best suburban dad-getting cardio outfit. I wandered the winding streets until I reached Karen's block, making sure to keep it casual. I slowed as I approached a house that matched the description I'd been given, 2 stories, with a tall oak tree in the front yard, a pristine walkway, and an almost militarily neat row of rose bushes flanking the porch. Out front was her mailbox, stenciled with Karen in all caps. The place looked exactly as I'd expect for an HOA president, not a single blade of grass out of place. The real revelation came when I circled around the back via a public walking path that ran behind a row of houses. That's where I saw it, Karen's fence. It wasn't just tall, it was monstrous. At least 8 feet high, made of some heavy-duty material with zero open lattice. If I had to guess, it seemed to exceed the typical 6-foot limit by a good 2 feet, maybe more. The top was covered with a pointed decorative trim that added more height. It was practically a fortress wall. That was shocking enough, but the biggest surprise came when I noticed something odd about how the fence lined up with her property markers. There were bright neon tags on the ground, presumably from a recent survey. The fence posts seemed to be well beyond her actual property line, like it was encroaching into what might be considered either a utility easement or city-owned land. In other words, it appeared illegally placed. I took a few quick photos with my phone, feeling both triumphant and slightly guilty, as if I was stooping to her level. But her hypocrisy was too blatant to ignore. Here she was lecturing me about my fence, brandishing questionable documents about height limits, all while she'd built something that was quite clearly out of compliance with both city codes and, ironically, the same HOA rule she was citing against me. My heart pounded with adrenaline as I snapped the shots. I then made my way home, head swirling with possibilities. Could I confront her directly with this evidence, or should I gather more information first? As it turned out, I wasn't the only neighbor who was suspicious. Once word got out that I was fighting with Karen over fence height, a few people reached out to me with their own stories of Karen's fence. One resident recalled a fiasco where Karen had sealed off part of her yard, ignoring multiple warnings from the city about a drainage easement. Another said he'd seen city workers surveying near Karen's fence, muttering that it was definitely not to code. It seemed that Karen had a history of ignoring rules for her own convenience, then turning around and enforcing them with an iron fist on everyone else. With this new knowledge, I decided the best approach was to gather as much legitimate documentation as possible. I filed an official request with the city's zoning department for a copy of any permits Karen might have pulled for her fence. My reasoning: if I discovered she never obtained the necessary paperwork, that would be powerful leverage if she continued to harass me. While waiting for the city to process my request, I also shot an email to the HOA board, minus Karen, asking for clarity on any alleged updates to the fence rules. Silence followed. Not a single board member responded with anything resembling an official or notarized change to the guidelines. I pressed Paula, the one board member who'd responded to me earlier, and she admitted privately that the board had never taken a vote on revising fence heights. Karen had drafted a proposal, but it was supposed to be discussed at the next meeting, not yet approved. So that pamphlet she waved in my face was a fake, or at best a premature piece of legislation not yet ratified. That was all I needed to hear. Karen was forging or prematurely finalizing HOA documents to push her personal agenda. This was major. Emboldened, I confronted her politely via email, CCing the entire board, stating that I had direct confirmation no revised fence policy had been voted on, and that I expected the daily fines to stop immediately. Predictably, Karen responded by doubling down. She wrote a scathing message accusing me of slander and threatened that if I continued with my defiance, she'd see to it that I faced severe financial penalties and possible legal action. The rest of the board, utter silence. They seemed afraid to cross Karen publicly, though I suspect many of them disliked her tactics. Days passed, turning into a tense week. Each morning, I braced myself for the next ridiculous letter from Karen or for a surprise visit from a city inspector. Instead, what I got was a thick envelope from the zoning department. Inside were documents indicating that Karen had never filed a permit for her monstrous fence extension. None at all. Zoning records indicated her property included an easement, meaning she was not allowed to build a permanent structure within that boundary, let alone a tall fence. The city had apparently discovered the fence months ago and issued her a warning. According to the file, she was instructed to remove or modify the fence to comply with local codes. She'd ignored it or possibly lied about removing it. No follow-up had occurred, possibly due to a backlog in enforcement. Either way, there it was in black and white. Karen's fence was illegal, both from an HOA standpoint, since it exceeded 6 feet, and a city code standpoint, due to encroachment on an easement without a permit. She was in far worse violation than I ever could have been. Armed with this smoking gun, I strategized the best way to use it. My wife, always the voice of reason, cautioned me not to stoop to Karen's level. Maybe we should just keep it as leverage in case things escalated. But then came the final straw. One evening, I was grilling burgers in my backyard, minding my own business, when I heard Karen's unmistakable voice on the other side of our newly completed fence. She was standing there, presumably on a step stool, peering over the lattice, loudly criticizing the shoddy craftsmanship of our build. My jaw tightened. I asked her politely to leave my property, but she shot back that she had every right to inspect fences for compliance. She then snapped a few photos with her phone. That was it. I'd had enough. I decided the next morning I would file an official complaint with the city about her fence. Why not? She'd come after me for abiding by the rules while blatantly ignoring them herself. I filled out the forms, attached the pictures I'd taken, and even included a copy of the city's own documents showing she had been warned months ago to rectify the violation. That same day, I also lodged a formal complaint with the HOA board, citing the actual written guidelines which Karen had broken. I pointed out the hypocrisy, stated that I expected them to intervene, and attached photographic evidence. Even if the board was reluctant to act, I wanted it all on record. The city responded much faster than I anticipated. Perhaps my complaint provided them with all the evidence they needed without having to do additional legwork. A city inspector called to confirm a good time to come to my neighborhood. I agreed to meet him after work. He arrived, took one look at Karen's fence from the public walking path, and shook his head. "Yeah, that's definitely out of compliance," he said. "We warned her about it months ago." He snapped more photos, took notes, and said he'd file an immediate notice of violation with a strict deadline to remove or modify the fence. If she didn't comply, the city could take legal action or impose hefty daily fines. I confess it felt a bit petty to stand there with the city inspector, nodding solemnly while internally cheering. But given how Karen had bullied us and tried to charge us daily fines on a fence we built legally, I couldn't help feeling a surge of righteous satisfaction. This was justice, or at least the beginning of it. A couple of days later, I came home from work to find Karen waiting on my driveway, arms folded tight across her chest. She looked furious enough to burst a blood vessel. "How dare you report me to the city?" she snarled. I calmly pointed out that she'd been threatening me for weeks over a fence that actually followed the rules, while she herself was ignoring city code. She launched into a tirade about how it's different, I have special circumstances, I needed a taller fence, and that the easement was barely relevant. Her voice trembled with rage, but I simply shrugged and said, "If you truly believe that, get the proper permit." She spat back that I was vindictive and petty. I responded that maybe she should have thought about that before forging HOA documents to bully me. Her face flushed so red I thought steam might shoot out of her ears. She stormed off, practically stomping holes into the grass as she marched down the sidewalk. Now you'd think that might have been the end of it. Karen, caught in her own hypocrisy, forced to tear down or modify her illegally built fence. But people like Karen rarely go down without a fight. Days later, the real showdown began. I got a notice in my mailbox stating that the HOA board had scheduled a formal hearing regarding my fence violations. It was to take place the following week in the neighborhood clubhouse. The notice threatened that if I failed to appear, the board could impose fines or file a lien. I rolled my eyes at the theatrics. I knew from Paula that the board never voted on any new fence policy, so I had a feeling this hearing was orchestrated by Karen to publicly shame me or corner me into submission. Nevertheless, I prepared. I printed out the city regulations, my building permit, the original HOA guidelines, and copies of my email exchanges that proved no official revision was ever passed. More importantly, I brought every shred of evidence that Karen's own fence was out of compliance. My wife accompanied me for moral support. We arrived at the clubhouse to find a half-dozen neighbors milling around, also summoned for various alleged infractions, everything from the color of someone's front door to the height of another's shrubbery. Karen was front and center behind a long table with a plastic tablecloth, flanked by a couple of board members. Paula sat off to one side, looking uncomfortable. They called me up first. Karen read from a script that said something like, "Homeowner at my address is in violation of the newly established fence height limit set forth by the association on some random date." She didn't look up from her paper, but her voice dripped with self-righteousness. I stepped up to the microphone, took a breath, and calmly dismantled her argument. I read from the official, older guidelines that allowed for decorative additions up to 8 inches above the standard 6 feet. I emphasized that no official notice was ever sent to the community regarding a revision. Then I cited city law, which clearly permitted fences up to 7 feet in the backyard. Finally, I informed the board that I had a letter from city zoning verifying my compliance. As I spoke, Karen's face hardened. She glanced at her co-conspirators on the board, who avoided eye contact. I finished by turning the tables. Furthermore, it has come to my attention that the HOA president herself erected an 8-foot fence with no permit, and it encroaches on a city easement. I have documentation here proving the city has issued her a violation notice. If this board is going to enforce fence rules, it should be consistent, not one-sided. I could almost hear a pin drop. A few neighbors in the audience murmured, some nodding in agreement. Karen's mouth twisted as though she'd bitten into a lemon. She tried to retort that her fence was a special case, but I read the exact code snippet that said no exceptions would be granted for fences in an easement area unless certain conditions were met. The new hearing turned from a one-sided condemnation of me into a full-blown crisis for Karen. The board members whispered among themselves. Paula looked relieved that everything was finally out in the open. One of them, an older gentleman named Stephen, cleared his throat and announced that the matter would need further review. Karen was livid, insisting I had orchestrated a smear campaign against her. The tension in the room was palpable, but the raw facts were on my side. I had permits, official codes, and photos verifying every claim. Karen had nothing but an unapproved, for all intents and purposes illegal fence. After the hearing concluded, the board agreed to drop all alleged fines against me, pending official clarification on the fence policy. Everyone could see the writing on the wall. My fence was legitimate, and Karen's was not. Over the next several days, I heard through the grapevine that the city had ramped up enforcement on Karen's property, giving her a strict deadline to tear down the portion of the fence that breached the easement or face substantial daily fines. The drama reached its climax when neighbors began snapping pictures of construction crews dismantling Karen's towering fortress wall. She tried to hush it up, but word spread like wildfire. People loved the irony. The woman who tried to nail me with daily fines for a lattice top ended up having to tear down her own fence at significant expense. I even heard rumors that some of her board allies distanced themselves, citing her reckless approach as too extreme. By the time the next HOA election rolled around, Karen had no support. She lost the presidency in a landslide, replaced by Paula, who promised a more transparent, neighbor-friendly style of leadership. Did Karen come banging on my door again, seeking revenge? Surprisingly, no. After her fence fiasco became public, she mostly kept to herself. Maybe she realized she'd overplayed her hand, or maybe she was simply humiliated. I'd see her occasionally in the neighborhood, scurrying around with a stony expression, never pausing to chat. She stopped issuing random citations. The board installed new checks and balances to prevent any single person from unilaterally creating updated guidelines. My wife and I carried on with our lives, enjoying our backyard behind that sweet, sweet fence. On sunny afternoons, I'd stand there in the warm glow, trailing a hand over the lattice top, remembering how close I'd come to tearing it down to appease Karen. Thank goodness I stayed firm. In the end, we kept our fence exactly as built. The city code we followed was correct, and the old HOA guidelines were still valid. Karen's little stunt forced the association to clarify all fence-related policies, ironically strengthening homeowners' rights in the process. Turns out half the neighbors had always wanted a bit more flexibility for decorative tops or slightly taller structures, especially when you have kids or pets to protect. Paula, the new president, said she was planning to propose an official update that would let people choose between 6-foot solid fences or 6-foot plus lattice. No mystery addendums or hidden language. Best of all, no more unwarranted fines for phony infractions. Sometimes, neighbors ask if I feel bad about blowing the whistle on Karen's fence. Honestly, I don't lose sleep over it. She was a walking case of rules for thee, not for me, and it was time someone held her accountable. The irony that she tried to accuse me of noncompliance while literally standing behind her illegally tall fence was too much to ignore. I didn't enjoy the conflict, but it sure felt good to see justice served. If you're going to lead an HOA, at least follow your own standards, right? The experience taught me a few lessons about suburban living. First, HOAs can be helpful for maintaining a cohesive neighborhood aesthetic, but only if the people in charge act in good faith. Second, always keep your paperwork in order. Permits, official guidelines, these become your shield against bullies. Third, stand your ground when you know you're in the right. People like Karen rely on intimidation and misinformation. The moment you expose their lies with cold, hard facts, their power crumbles. And last but not least, keep your sense of humor, because there's a certain comedic factor to seeing someone tear down their own fence after spending weeks hounding you over yours. Life in the suburbs is never dull. Even now, whenever I stand on my back porch, gazing at that wooden masterpiece we built, I'm reminded of the entire ordeal. Sometimes I let my hand rest on the top rail, feeling the texture of the cedar, the gentle patterns of the wood grain. I think back to the day Karen threatened me in my pajamas, brandishing a clipboard of bogus rules. If I'd panicked, if I'd caved, I'd have missed out on the fence I'd always wanted. But by holding firm, by verifying the real rules, by poking into Karen's own shady situation, I ended up with not only a fence but also a restored sense of justice in our neighborhood. We soared past her attempts to bully us, and in the process, helped push a corrupt HOA president out of power. That's not to say everything became perfect overnight. There were ripples of tension in the following months as the board navigated the aftermath of Karen's self-made fiasco. A few diehard supporters of Karen tried to claim that I was the troublemaker, that I'd crossed a line by reporting her fence to the city. But the vast majority of neighbors recognized the reality. Karen was the one forging guidelines and violating codes. She reaped what she sowed. And ironically, in the end, more people thanked me for being willing to speak up. One older couple even dropped by to give me a homemade pie, telling me about the time Karen had fined them for having a small bench on their front porch that she deemed unapproved furniture. They'd been too scared to fight back. They were grateful that someone had finally stood up to the tyranny. I do remember a moment of personal satisfaction one afternoon when I caught sight of the demolition crew taking the last few boards off Karen's fence extension. The city inspector had mandated she reduce it to the standard 6 feet and address the encroachment on the easement. She stood in her yard, arms crossed, scowling as workers carried away massive wooden panels. The fence she had bragged about, the same fence behind which she'd mocked my violation, was now in pieces, thrown into the back of a truck. Even from across the street, I could feel the waves of embarrassment radiating off her. I was tempted to walk over and strike up a sarcastic conversation, but I decided that stooping to gloat would only drag me down to her level. Instead, I waved politely and went about my day, whistling a little tune. If she felt singled out, well, that was the universe handing her a dose of her own medicine. Life carried on peacefully from that point. My wife and I resumed our normal routine. We hosted a small barbecue to celebrate finishing the fence, inviting a few close neighbors. One friend teased us, "So how's the too-tall fence these days?" We all laughed. The stress we'd felt had melted away. I realized that for the first time since moving in, I could truly exhale. The yard felt like ours again, a sanctuary untainted by petty disputes. Even the vegetables in my little garden patch seemed to thrive better. Maybe that was just me projecting a sense of relief onto them, but it felt like everything was falling into place. Karen, to my knowledge, eventually stepped down or was voted out from her position on the board after the fiasco. She tried to spin a story that she was leaving for personal reasons, but everybody knew the real reason. No one wanted an HOA president who'd lie about official guidelines just to push her personal preferences, and who would blame others while ignoring her own glaring violations. Paula stepped in as interim president and later won the official vote. Under her leadership, the association improved communications, posted updates to the online portal promptly, and even invited community feedback on every proposed rule change. A new sense of trust and unity began to permeate the neighborhood, a kind of post-Karen renaissance, if you will. My wife joked that maybe we should commemorate it by adding a plaque to our fence. This fence survived Karen's wrath. We didn't, of course, but the joke alone was enough to remind us how far we'd come. I often wonder what Karen told her friends or relatives about the saga. Did she paint me as some cunning villain who tricked the city into targeting her fence? Did she ever acknowledge her own hypocrisy and the fact that her downfall was entirely self-inflicted? I'll probably never know. But I do know that the entire affair was a lesson in the old adage: those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Or in this case, those who build illegal 8-foot fences shouldn't harass the guy with the legally constructed fence next door. It's amazing how quickly the tables can turn once the truth comes to light. In a sense, I should probably thank Karen. If not for her overreach, I'd never have discovered my own backbone or recognized just how vital it is to question authority when it's obviously being misused. We'd all be living under her thumb, paying arbitrary fines, following whimsical rules she invented on a whim. Instead, the entire neighborhood is freer and friendlier because we realized we had the power to stand up and say no. So that's how our fence fiasco ended. My so-called too-tall fence still stands proud at 6 feet plus a decorative lattice, officially sanctioned by city permits and older HOA guidelines. Karen's monstrous wall, on the other hand, was forcibly reduced to standard height, exposing much of her backyard to the world. These days, the only time I even remember the drama is when I lean against the fence in the twilight, enjoying the summer breeze. Occasionally, I'll catch a glimpse of Karen trudging by with her head down, no longer the unstoppable force she once pretended to be. And I can't help but smile, thinking about how poetic it is that she ended up losing a battle she started. She once told me I'd regret not complying with her version of the rules. Funny how life works. She's the one who ended up regretting her own refusal to follow the real rules. Thank you for sticking around to hear this crazy tale about fences, hypocrisy, and sweet, sweet justice. If you enjoyed hearing about how I managed to outmaneuver the biggest HOA Karen in the neighborhood, be sure to give this video a like, subscribe to Taleflow for more outrageous stories of suburban drama, and drop a comment below if you've ever encountered an HOA nightmare. I'd love to hear your own anecdotes or any thoughts on how we handled this situation. Until next time, stay vigilant, know your rights, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is just standing your ground and letting the Karen in your life sabotage herself. Catch you in the next video.